Welcome to the Future of Crowdsourcing, a multi-part series. In this webinar, we're going to look at microtasking, what it is, and where it's going. I'm your host, David Bratfold from Daily Crowdsource, your #1 site for crowdsourcing news. First off, I'd like to thank our sponsors, DesignCrowd, which offers custom graphic design work online to businesses risk-free. You can learn more at designcrowd.com. Also, Napkin Labs, making your social networks more productive. You can learn more at napkinlabs.com. If you're on Twitter, we invite you to use the hashtag CrowdFuture to tweet about this event. With us today is Mark Allen, the General Manager for Clickworker's U.S. business. Clickworker is one of the original microtasking companies, founded in 2006. With their service, you can source a broad range of work such as SEO text creation, photo and video tagging, and online research. They have a curated crowd and a consulting service layer that focuses the unique strengths of crowdsourcing onto solving customer problems. We also have Brent Frei, founder and chairman of Smartsheet. Smartsheet's a leading enterprise-ready project management, collaboration, and simple CRM tool, which has built a dead simple user interface for accessing mTurk to crowdsource simple tasks. And Zack Russell, client services specialist for Samasource. Samasource brings dignified computer-based work such as content moderation, data entry, and other outsourcing services to women, youth, and refugees living in poverty. Thanks for joining us. If we're going to measure the effects of crowdsourcing, we need to be able to quantify it. And that means coming to an agreement about some basic standards. To quantify microtasking, Daily Crowdsource began collecting data from the past 6 years. And after we uncovered some intriguing data, we decided to produce an industry report and launch this webinar series. So here we are. Let's go ahead and start our discussion with a poll. How many of you in our audience have used a microtasking service? Go ahead and vote on your screen. While we wait, I'll ask our panelists about what microtasking really is. Mark, let's start with you. How do you define microtasking?
Good morning, David. Hey, thanks so much for organizing this webinar. I think it's really an interesting series and idea, and I appreciate being part of it. To define microtasking, we have, as you've defined, a few different terms people use, but I think the easiest way to think about it is it's a discrete action that can be completed with a few keystrokes via a web browser. So I look at a photo and I type in what I see in that photo would be a microtask.
Excellent. And Brent, how do you define it any differently? Or Zack, how about you? How does Samasource define microtasking?
Thanks, David. And I think Mark kind of took the words right out of my mouth. Very much in the same way. So any discrete task that can be completed on a computer with internet connection, really.
Excellent. Now let's go ahead and take a look at our poll to see the results. Now that we know, looks like about half of the audience has used a microtasking service. So Mark, could you briefly describe your service and how it qualifies as microtasking?
Sure, David. We actually do a pretty broad range of services, some of which I would define as microtasking, some I would not. For example, we do a lot of original content SEO text creation, and some of that work can actually be a 10 or 15-minute task to write one specific SEO text. And I wouldn't necessarily call that a microtask. When I think of microtasking, I really think more of the quick response, the photo tagging, video tagging. Today there's a lot of search relevance activity, kind of instant polling, a lot of work going on that I find very interesting in terms of instant focus groups. And again, I don't think there's an absolute definition. If it takes 1 minute, is it a microtask? If it takes 5 minutes, is it not a microtask? But in our way of thinking, which gets into recruitment and training, we're looking at microtasks as really being something that can be completed within a very short burst, less than a couple of minutes.
And that seems like a pretty good definition, and that's what we've found is there's quite a bit of disparity in the definitions of microtasking, from just a couple seconds to several minutes. How about you, Brent?
Yeah, the way that we've approached it, since our tool is much more designed around simple CRM or project management, is that the microtasking is a component of the work that's being conducted in that project. So if you think about doing a product launch, there are a number of people involved in your company. Some of them may be outside the company. There may be a lawyer that needs to review the text, and so you have effectively outsourced that bigger chunk to that outsourced person. If you take that to its logical conclusion, you end up with a lot of tasks that can be done by someone that you absolutely don't know. So it could be finding all the analysts that have conducted research on your product. You can find all the email addresses of the writers that have written about that product category. You can research the editorial calendars. All of those things can be done in microtasks by people that you don't know. So if you have an interface that's friendly enough for the person that actually is a marketing manager or a product manager to reach out and get that help done on that part of the work that they have to do really simply from a crowd, then you've really expanded the size of the team. And so it's much more about being able to get work done quickly, either in volume or in very small quantities as part of the work that you're currently doing.
Sure. Now, these three services, Clickworker, Samasource, and Smartsheet, are all very different. Smartsheet is first and foremost a project management and simple CRM tool, and then you have the smart sourcing feature added on in addition to it. Do you anticipate any increase in the requests from the smart sourcing feature within your services?
We get a lot of new customers every month from it. We've had almost 1,000 individual companies or people use this as a feature, and so that utility is simply passed on through to Mechanical Turk or Samasource or Clickworker or anyone that has a curated crowd. So the idea would be that as the volume of the kinds of work that increase, that we're able to direct it to the appropriate crowd. So whether it's Clickworker, Samasource, or Mechanical Turk.
Sure, and Zack, Samasource has a unique model of sourcing labor with physical work centers in impoverished regions of the world, mainly Africa and Nairobi area. Can you briefly tell us about your service?
Yeah, sure. So, as you mentioned, Samasource is a social enterprise, and our whole mission is to deliver work to the developing world. So we work with a number of large tech companies here in the Valley, as well as some other companies, and we take their large data projects and we load them up onto our platform and we distribute those to our workforce. As you mentioned, Nairobi, but also in rural India, Pakistan, Uganda, South Africa, and Haiti. So some of our core services include content generation, so writing short paragraphs or product descriptions for SEO purposes. And we also do data enrichment work, so business listing verification, data mining work, image tagging, and then we also provide some custom services, so content generation, as you mentioned, as well as audio transcription work.
And how does the fact that you have dedicated workers affect the quality of your work produced?
Yeah, sure. So we have, really this is a livelihood for our workers. So they're going to their centers on a daily basis, and they're actually assigned to specific kinds of projects. Each worker needs to pass a gating and qualification test that's built into our platform, and then they go through some pretty rigorous training. And since they're completing the same kind of work each day, they just get better and better through task redundancy, and they actually start to specialize in a certain area. So then we can, send specific work types to certain workers.
And do you keep them, once they specialize, do you keep them working in that specialty?
Yeah. So we just kind of like to build on, on that specialization.
But you still pay your workers per task, just like the microtasking system, right?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. And Mark, which vertical markets are growing the fastest in your opinion?
Well, it's a really interesting space right now because we're seeing interest from 2-people startups trying to use crowdsourcing to help them develop a business without building overhead, to Fortune 500 companies looking at sort of a next generation of BPO efficiency. So it's hard to say that this one industry is taking off versus another, because there's just really an incredible amount of interest from a broad cross-section. The one thing that does seem to be a new and interesting use is this idea of instant focus groups. The idea that the crowd provides subjective opinion, and subjective opinion can be very valuable when evaluating a UI, or evaluating search relevance, or evaluating even product packaging, things like that. So we're seeing tremendous interest in that area. What's also really neat about crowdsourcing in that respect is that it can be regionalized. So you could do an instant focus group across the United States, or you could do it just in the Boston metro area, depending on what your product and service is, and depending on the opinions you're trying to extract.
Well, that's pretty cool. You can get super focused then, can't you?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. And then, Zack, how does Samasource define a unit of work? I want to get definitions from everyone.
Yeah, sure. I think we price out per task. So task is any unit of work that's delivered back to the client, and we tend to define it a little bit, somewhat larger. So, for instance, with the business listing verification task, we would consider one business validated or verified as a task, rather than just say, a business phone number is one task, business address is another task. Internally, we may break down certain tasks into more discrete tasks for our workers to complete, but working with clients, a task is any task.
The whole task.
Yeah, exactly.
And then with that, does one worker complete the whole listing verification?
Yeah, they could.
Okay.
Or we may break it up into more discrete chunks.
Oh, sure. Of course. And Brent, what about Smartsheet? You guys are definitely within Mechanical Turk right now. How do you guys define a unit of work?
It's very similar to Zack's. It's any question and any number of answers that is associated with that question. So I may pass in a company name and then say, give me the website, the CEO's email address, and their contact phone number. That's one task.
Got it. Mark, how does Clickworker define a unit of work?
The same, with interestingly enough, the same sort of internal use of task with two definitions, but externally we always use it with a single definition. The granularity there, though, is interesting. So if you think of a list verification, we might have a company name that we're trying to clarify 4 fields for that one company. With certain projects, all 4 of those fields completed for that one company could be considered one task if one worker is doing it, right? I'm given the name and I complete all 4 actions, and therefore it's one task because I'm charging the company for that one task and I'm paying the worker for that one task. But in another workflow, we might actually divide that into 4 tasks completed by 4 workers who, and the company would pay, for each of those 4 tasks.
Sure.
And if you think of it in dollars, so if there's 4 fields and I'm paying a nickel per field, in one case I'm paying the worker a nickel to complete one field, and that's one task. In another case, I'm paying the worker to complete all 4 fields, I'm paying them 20 cents, and again, that would be one task. So there is opportunity for some confusion.
Sure, and I figured you guys would all have a similar definition. Right now we've got another poll. We want to see what everyone thinks. We actually have the statistic we'll show up in just a second, but how fast do you think the microtasking market grew in 2010? Let's go ahead and do a quick vote on your screen. We'll see what everyone thinks, and while the listeners are voting, we want to hear what the panelists think. Brent, what do you think the microtasking market grew in 2010?
That's a good question. I'm gonna guess 250%.
Okay, well, that's a good guess. We like guesses. Mark, what about your guess? What would you say?
I'm going to raise Brent to 500.
Okay, got a game of poker here. It looks like Zack. You want to raise him? What do you think it is, Zack?
I'm a pretty conservative guy, so I'll go 250.
Excellent. Okay. Looks like we got in some good results. Microtasking saw a huge surge in 2009, but most recently saw 496% growth in 2010. So nearly 500% growth. 162% growth in only the first 3 quarters of 2011. Now the number of clients using it is still extremely small, just around 20,000, but grew 82% in the first 3 quarters of 2011. So it's still a very, very small market, but growing quick. Brent, how do you explain the growth of the microtasking market, and where do you think it is going?
I think it's twofold. One is there are a lot of big companies that are getting work done that wasn't previously economically possible. Actually,
Sure.
in some ways it wasn't possible, period, and then in other ways it wasn't economically possible as well. And the second is that it's becoming a little bit more mainstream, so that more folks are finding out that this is possible. Interestingly, we talked to a lot of people that, as you described, what they can do with crowdsourcing and the costs, and it doesn't make logical sense to them, so they discount the possibility even if you show it to them.
Sure. Yeah, and that's we see a lot of that where it's education marketing. People have to learn what the heck this is first. Mark, despite the high sounding numbers, this growth is still slow compared to the possibilities. What do you attest this to, and when do you predict a huge surge in client growth?
Well, if we can keep growing at 500%, I'll be very comfortable with that growth. So, statistics are interesting. What I see right now is if I go in stages and just kind of break it into 6-month stages. 6 months ago, we were spending a lot more time, and I mean we collectively, everybody on this phone, Daily Crowdsourcing, etc. Collectively, we were doing a lot more explaining what is crowdsourcing than we were explaining why is crowdsourcing important to your business. And over the last 6 months, I've seen a significant change in that conversation, whereas now instead of somebody coming in and saying, please explain to me what crowdsourcing is, they come in and they start with a concept and they say, I think crowdsourcing could help me with this area. And then we get into a problem-solving discussion, which is always very productive. I think what we'll see in the next 6 to 12 months is a lot more of that, a lot of experimentation. And that's what I see now as well, is a lot of people saying, I think this can help me, but let me try it. Let me do this little project here and that little project there. I don't see yet where there's been large acceptance of building the service into the business process, and that will be the next growth phase. And that has to do with, 1, experimenting and understanding the results of the experiment, and 2, overcoming the natural human skepticism about anything new. We generally, when we come across something new, our response is to be skeptical, and we collectively, again, have to prove that skepticism is unwarranted.
Sure, and I'm sure all the companies see it the same way. Let's take a look at the poll results. It looks like most of the people in the audience chose 250% growth. It's interesting to see where it was actually as around 500%. So it's a little bit higher than what people are anticipating. Now, Zack, one thing we're interested in is microtasking a lucrative source of work for your workers?
Yes, absolutely. So, we basically source our workers depending on what they were getting paid before. We define poverty as anyone who's making around $3 a day. We've serviced over 1,600 workers, and we found actually on average that they're supporting upwards of 5 people each. So that comes out to around 8,000 people impacted.
Wow.
I actually had the good fortune of being able to go out to Nairobi and visit with some of our workers. And I woke up the other day, and as many people here in the Valley, I checked my iPhone immediately to see what email I got. I actually got an email from one of our workers saying that, thanking us for the work, and he was able to purchase a netbook and send his sister to school for that quarter,
Wow.
in addition to paying all his own fees. So,
Sure.
yes, it absolutely is a significant level of income for our workers.
Now, Samasource has an interesting model. So do you see their salaries increasing over the next 5 years, or do you want to focus on lowering the costs to the client?
Yeah, that's a fair question. And we actually don't see those things as necessarily mutually exclusive.
Sure.
We think that through a really robust platform and intelligent task design that you can actually serve both ends. So you can actually pay out living wages and also be competitive in bids with for-profit companies. We have to be competitive in order to actually deliver work, but we think through intelligent task design and a really good platform that we can serve really both parties that we're looking to serve.
Right. And what are your primary barriers to growth?
At this point, we received over $3 million in funding, but we think that we need to get to around above $10 million just so we can kind of build out our internal team. So we've got great technology and we've got a pretty good sales engine as it is. It just needs to be larger. So acquiring that funding is going to be pretty important for us.
Sure. What about you, Mark? What do you see as Clickworker's primary barrier to growth?
I think that it's this whole process we're going through now of education. Again, I really want to thank you, David. You guys are doing a great job providing resources to people to understand this seminar being one of them, the crowd consensus that you're putting together and you're showing us some of the results from. I think it's all part of the puzzle to giving people information that helps them make decisions about how to be more efficient, as well as the process of overcoming skepticism and building in, real credibility based on performance, and to me it's very important that we base it on more than just cost savings, because I think the cost savings piece of it is in a certain way false gold. The real benefit from my perspective should be in improving efficiency, improving quality, improving scalability. All of these things bring value. I don't know that we can be the most expensive solution, but I think we want to be careful of focusing all our energy on being the least expensive solution.
Sure, and that's definitely a point, and I think we'll get to that in just a few minutes. Before we do that, though, Zack, where does Samasource see the microtasking field in 5 years?
Yeah, I think certainly disruptive in alleviating poverty. Beyond that, I think that we've got really good worker retention. So I think that we're going to continue to see our workers specialize in certain areas and get better at the work that they're currently doing, and then potentially find other work that we could do. And then I'd also say that kind of getting back to the definition of micro work. I think it'll be interesting to see how workers and crowdsourcing platforms start to collaborate on tasks. So rather than just splitting up one task into discrete chunks and sending it out to anonymous workers, potentially we'll see teams working on an individual task so that we can start to develop and work on getting those more complicated kinds of tasks.
As in, like, more collaboration, workers collaborating together?
Yeah, exactly. So having small teams tackle specific tasks.
Oh, great. Now, you talked about retention. Are you able to tell us any sort of a broad statistic on how long your workers stick around?
Yeah, I can tell you that most of our workers already have been with Samasource for over a year. Wow. When you look at the areas in which we operate, the turnover in the BPO industry is really high in India. So that's definitely kind of a value add that we have, is that our workers aren't constantly cycling in and out. So we're not investing lots of time on training new workers.
And I'm sure that's real helpful because you guys do quite a bit of training, don't you?
Yeah, we do training to onboard workers, but those workers aren't constantly cycling in and out.
Sure. Now, Brent, in our interview for the Microtasking Industry Report, you mentioned what's on the top of Smartsheet's mind is further improving the ease of use. Now, I've used your tool. Is it even possible to get any easier?
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's the interface is designed very much like a spreadsheet. So simply, IDing cells that you want someone to put data in and it just appears is pretty easy. But forming the questions and getting the expected results are still always going to be tough, given the flexibility with what people can possibly ask. And so, similar to what Zack and Mark had said already, I think there's going to be a huge focus on quality, and that quality is going to come through specialization. So the kind of things that we would do is create predefined workflows either in our app or target workforces that have predefined workflows that aren't necessarily the lowest cost, but are the highest probability of great quality. And I think that is going to be the single biggest trend in paid crowdsourcing in the next few years is those folks that can provide very high quality, very reliable, very timely results for good price, but it won't necessarily be the best. So you're not continually working on the QA process and getting redundant answers that actually cost you more to end up with something that you think is credible.
Right. And we're hearing quite a bit about specialization, so I'm interested to see if that really is where things go. Also, does Smartsheet have plans to expand its functionality within the Smart Sourcing feature?
We do. And in fact, some of that is aligned with what I just talked about, is either designing specific workflows that are some of the common use cases for our customers, or pointing at some of the crowds out there that have already pre-built those workflows.
Sure. Now, Mark, where will Clickworker be in 5 years?
Boy, if I could predict a 5-year window, I'd be
the gold mine, huh?
a lot smarter than I am. I think what I will say that I think is very predictable in our industry is that we have, one, it will continue to grow at a phenomenal pace. I have no doubt about that whatsoever, because there are so many ways that crowdsourcing is more efficient and more effective than any other means. I do believe that there's a lot of fracture to the industry from the standpoint of we've all got these different approaches. In the case of Clickworker, we've taken this vertical integration approach where we have the consulting layer, the quality layer, and the crowd layer all combined. There are a lot of people that are only focusing on one of the three or two of the three. And then there's a lot of people focusing on a very, very broad range of verticals. What will happen over the next 5 years is there will be a lot of consolidation. And we certainly expect to be part of that, but I would not care to predict where it will lead in 5 years.
Now, consolidation in terms of the service offerings within companies, or consolidation of all the companies? Some are going to consolidate, disappear, or whatever.
Consolidation of the number of players. There
Sure.
will be that traditional technology trend toward a few dominant players, then several really focused niche players, and then I think there will be internal adoption by a lot of big companies. I think that big companies will, right now, they always go through a make versus buy versus rent scenario, and for the time being, most of them have decided to rent. But at some point, they will decide, there may be a better model for make versus buy.
Sure. Now, also, you've recently stated that focusing on low cost is driving the industry down. Can you elaborate on this, and why do you think this is so?
Sure. I think that it has to do with the nature of looking at the deliverable as a task. And when you think of a task, you automatically gravitate toward a commodity view. And I think we've done that. And I think it's actually pretty natural. I don't see it as being, this terrible step. I see it as being something we need to be aware of and rethink. And the rethinking, from my perspective, has to come from a few different areas. One is that all of these companies out there are looking for help. They're not looking for crowds. They're looking for somebody to help them solve a problem in a way that is efficient and effective. And in the end, that doesn't necessarily mean it has to be the low-cost solution. So I think we should be charging more for our consulting layer. And I mean that specifically for Clickworker, but I also mean it for all of us here in the industry. We're providing a tremendous amount of value for our consulting layer, and most of us are still sort of stuck with, well, we'll charge this much per task because we pay this much per task. I think the second area really has to do with quality, and the quality definition revolves around the kinds of things that the crowd can do that can't be done any other way. And I'm thinking again of the instant focus group approach. That when you look at that, there's no other way to accomplish that. So if it's important to an enterprise to get that information, there becomes the opportunity for a much larger margin in the sale. And I think now is the right time, as we're gaining visibility and acceptance, to start shifting the pricing formula from this sort of commodity-based pricing to really a value-based pricing around the service and value we're bringing to the enterprise.
Sure, and I completely agree. In fact, I bring this up because I agree. I've seen it from the beginning where, to me, crowdsourcing, the real value of it is the better quality results, the higher value. And even in the early days with the design crowdsourcing, I enjoyed how it was based around getting a better product. And then now I'm even starting to see companies like 99 Designs focus more on the costs. And to me, I feel like it'll only turn around if a lot of the major players in the industry start to focus less on the total cost. And when you have companies like MTurk, the most known company, purely focus on low cost, what can be done about it, Mark?
Well, I think first, I think we should be careful not to blame MTurk. Sure. To me, they've built a platform for exchanging micro task work. It's an efficient and effective platform, and as with any sort of marketplace platform, there is a supply and demand factor to it. Where I'm focused is the layers of service that we or Samasource or Brent are adding, and there is a tremendous amount of value. For example, in Smartsheet, you said it earlier. You said, how could you? This thing is so easy to use and so simple. How could you make it even easier? And there's value in that. There's value in somebody being able to use a service like Smartsheet, launch an effective project, get back results quickly and efficiently, and all those other things. And so the value add is really in that layer of service and consulting that sits between the client and the crowd.
Sure. And Brent, are low costs hurting or helping your microtasking service, Smartsheet?
They aren't hurting or helping. Pretty much what Mark was saying. It's incumbent on technology vendors like us to create solutions that either sit between or independently are the answer to what people are trying to accomplish. And so, in Amazon or in Mechanical Turk's case, it's great. It's basically an API to human performed tasks. And so you've got Crowdflower and Casting Words and Smartsheet and others that have created different interfaces on top of that actually are consumable. The 1,000+ companies that have used Mechanical Turk through Smartsheet would have had no chance of using Mechanical Turk directly.
Sure.
So we've made it accessible, and other people have not just made that and other crowds accessible. They've taken all of the guesswork out of it by saying, hey, we're we're going to provide you a visual design for your company logo, or we're going to transcribe this 3 minutes of text perfectly every time. And so I think that the fact that at the far end of those solutions there is a very low cost quote API of human tasks is actually very good. Otherwise, it would be difficult to assemble the casting words of the world.
Sure, and I agree with Mark. That MTurk is not to blame. In my conversations I've had with them, that's where they want to fit, and to be honest, they fit in really well. Now, Zack, is it correct to assume most of your work is from American companies to African and Indian workers?
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, most of our footprint is in rural India and Africa.
Sure. And then what challenges does that present working across international lines in a sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, we need to train our workers around how to be kind of more informal and conversational. I mean, in Nairobi, people are pretty formal, so we just need to give them some training around that voice. But we operate in areas that were former British colonies, so all training is done in English. Our workers are fluent in English. In Nairobi, they watch tons of American television, American music, so they're pretty well versed on American culture. So generally we found that it really poses very few problems actually.
Sure. A lot of our viewers are interested in managing global crowds. So Mark, do you face a challenge with your global crowd?
Actually, what we're seeing is there are differences regionally, there are differences by country, culture, language, etc. So, certainly it makes it a little bit more complicated, but in the end it doesn't really make it more difficult, and it actually gives us the ability to deliver a whole variety of services that we couldn't deliver if we were English only. So from a standpoint of managing the crowd, we have a single platform, we have a single vision for curating the community and doing worker assessments and training. All of those aspects are viewed from a global perspective. But then we get a lot more granular when we get into delivering specific services for a specific customer, depending on where the work is being based. So we might approach the actual training for SEO text creation for, let's say, a hotel client. We would do a different training in Germany than we would do in the United States. But at the high level, all of the goals, all of the platform, all of the systems are the same. It's just getting down into the actual, call it curriculum, that we adjust to the local style and the local need.
Now, does that, what you call maybe the curriculum, does that become too vast to control? Is it something that's easy to manage, or do you see it becoming more difficult?
It's a great question, David, and it kind of gets back to my thinking about pricing and my thinking about the service and the consulting layer that we provide. So if we look at the pricing as a commodity and we look at the pay to the worker as a commodity, then it actually is very challenging, because we're really unable to necessarily attract the right crowd or deliver the right product. But if we flip the equation and say, what is it the customer needs? What is the ROI? What is the pain point? What is the challenge? We are uniquely equipped to deliver to that, and therefore we charge to create unique curriculum for a unique project, or we charge to recruit and curate a specific crowd needed for a specific task. And when we kind of flip the equation around what are the services we're delivering that we're uniquely capable of delivering, the whole pricing formula flows from that, and it becomes in my mind, a distinctive competence that we offer.
Sure. Now, Brent, does Smartsheet do any managing of your crowd?
We do not. We are the beneficiaries of other people's crowds, so we don't manage them. But I will say, I will second what Mark just said in that the smarts and services aspect of helping clients get what they want, I think, is a big big part of future growth. And in fact, there's a lot of cases where the smart sourcing, or we call it smart sourcing, the crowdsourcing work that is done to our product is actually a fraction of the actual cost to the end customer. Someone that says, hey, I want to build a list of all of the blogs around the world that are focused on hurricane science, or I want the names and addresses of all the plaintiffs' attorneys for every active lawsuit in a particular industry today. They can't possibly figure out the process to go get that through crowdsourcing, but
right.
And ultimately, what we charge to help them figure out that process to make it happen is typically 10 times the price of the actual work that gets done.
Sure. Now, you're kind of touching on that. Are you seeing customers coming to you saying, "I need this or that data. I need business listings." They don't necessarily know to call it crowdsourcing. They just know that that's what they want.
Since it's a feature in the app, they actually discover it and recognize. So some come to us because they know about it. Some discover it as a feature in their app and then wonder if it's possible. We also, because all of the tasks are public out there, we keep them. We monitor them. We watch what people are asking the workers for, and sometimes they're ill-formed, and so we can reach out to our clients privately and help them, form them better. And then when we understand what they're really looking for, we'll often give them guidance.
Sure, and I think it's important to note that crowdsourcing doesn't just fix everything. You have to ask intelligent questions. You have to put in intelligent input. Otherwise, you just end up getting too broad of answers, or perhaps the workers don't understand the request. Now, talking about collaboration within the crowd, I know Zack talked about it a little bit. Mark, was there any collaboration on the George Eastman project, or do your crowds ever collaborate?
So it's a great question, and at the high level, the whole success of a project is around collaboration between the client and our experts. But at the crowd level, we have not done any projects where the crowd is actually collaborating amongst itself, if you will.
Right. At least where they know they're collaborating.
All of the work we've done has been somewhat discreet, and it's actually a really interesting, and Zack said it earlier, it's a really interesting idea to create some intrinsic value, intrinsic motivation around a collaborative approach versus sort of the isolation of the microtask approach. And I'm really intrigued by the idea. We haven't done anything with it, but it's something we will be exploring further.
Do you happen to know when?
We actually, as a result of the CrowdConf last week, we have made a connection with an academic that's doing a lot of research on intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and I don't quite know where that's going to lead us, other than it will lead us down a variety of paths, one of which will absolutely be collaboration.
Excellent. Well, at this time, I'd like to ask some of our audience's burning questions, but want to again say thanks to Design Crowd and Napkin Labs for helping make all this possible. Now, here's our last poll, and we're interested to see the audience's response. So we'll get this on the screen in a second, but do you believe that microtasking has a small or big role in the future of work? Those of you watching at your offices or at home, go ahead and take a second to vote whether you think microtasking has a small or big role. And be honest, we're not saying here it's a cure-all for everything. I'm obviously assuming all three of our panelists will probably want to say big role. Feel free, anyone, to correct me if I'm wrong. While we're waiting for those polls, Zack, just a quick question. Samasource has recently started posting your living wages paid on your website. I'd love to just get a little clarification on what exactly is that counting. Is that pure U.S. dollar crowd payouts, or is it some sort of adjusted cost of living?
Yeah, that's actually pure U.S. dollar crowd payouts. So as you can imagine, in the developing world, that goes a long way. So actually, back in June, we surpassed our $1 million paid out to workers. And obviously, since that time, we're growing really quickly. So we're pretty far beyond that point.
Okay, now let's take a look at our results. Looks like 3/4 of the audience believes microtasking has a big role in the future of work, which is good for the panelists and good for all of us, I suppose. And then, Mark, let's kind of finish up with quality versus cost. How does Clickworker maximize quality versus cost? Because you can obviously increase the redundancy of tasks as large as you want, but it increases the cost along with it.
So we take a few different approaches. First and foremost, we start with a client needs assessment. What is it they're trying to accomplish? What's worked? What hasn't? What are the quality requirements they have? What are their own internal quality assurance processes that they may place on top of whatever processes we deliver? So there's a large conversation around quality, which tends to be relatively generic from a word choice. So we don't say, gosh, would you like to do injection testing?
Sure.
Because that's not really the point. The point is for them to define what level of quality is required and for us to come back with a solution that meets that quality level. Once we understand the customer requirement, we then will apply several tiers to the quality assurance process. One is some of the traditional stuff that everybody talks about, golden questions or injection testing, redundancy. In our crowd curation, we may have experts, and so we may have a redundancy level where a worker completes a task and then it flows through an expert level. So there's a lot of approaches from that perspective. And then there's also significant opportunities in terms of what we call training, assessment, and developing unique curriculum for any specific project. Some projects don't require it. Some projects are really straightforward. A 2-paragraph description is enough. Other projects, we've actually created 30-minute trainings in order to meet the quality standards that the customer is looking for. So each case is different, but it falls under that broad range of tactics.
Sure, a 30-minute training, that kind of extends the definition of microtask, I suppose.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. It's a very different approach, but again, it's all about bringing value. And if we're bringing value, the opportunity to make that project profitable rests on delivering the right training to the workers.
Sure, and sometimes I think we forget that customer doesn't necessarily care what it's called, if it's called a microtask or a large task. They just want to get the work done.
Correct. Absolutely.
Now, here's another good question from the audience, and if you have any more questions, we're getting a bunch of great questions, so send them in. This one's about speed. Zack, we'll start with you, but what do the panelists expect for the future of turnaround times for microtasks? And then also follows up with, will requests be met in real time in the near future?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of how we operate here at Samasource, we tend to like to get sort of the 2-week trial phase just to train up our workers. And then beyond that, we really start to crank it up. So I think that, MTurk is a great system if you're looking to just turn on the faucet really quickly for high volumes on a one-off project. But here at Samasource, we're looking for kind of ongoing work. And given ample time, then we can really kind of crank up on volumes. Where the crowdsourcing industry is going, I think that there are going to be, it seems like there are a lot of startups that are getting interested in using crowdsourcing to kind of cut their overhead costs.
Sure.
And considering, how they can be, how they're looking to be really agile, I imagine that those turnaround times are only going to, increase. So.
Sure. I actually saw an app at the CrowdConf from a gentleman who is attempting to do real-time microtasking, where when you're writing a post, a blog post, a news post, if you want to test out a couple of different titles, you can put in these titles and then send it to the crowd, and the crowd will be answering them while you're writing your post. And so you can see the results probably with Ajax or some sort of dynamic technology. In a sense, it's real-time. So I'm interested to see how that develops.
Right, right. And David, just to add to that point, we actually do have a number of real-time projects.
Excellent. Mark, do you have anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there will be a model that is either real-time or near real-time in terms of response. If you think of sort of Quora or Ask.com or a lot of these information resources, they will continue to evolve toward real-time, and the crowd will be a very important part of being able to deliver that.
Sure, and I shouldn't leave Smartsheet out. I know when I use the tool, one of the things I loved about it, perhaps it was my generation of have to get results right now. As soon as I ask the questions, I start to see my spreadsheet populated with the results. So
yeah,
I know that was a big thing.
Yeah, we definitely coach our customers who we talk to pay up for results. And so an average task is 20 cents in the Smartsheet world, and what ends up happening is that because that's a high price in Mechanical Turk land, the results generally come back in less than 10 minutes.
Sure. Now here's a question from the crowd, not directed at any particular panelist if anyone feels to jump in, but can microworkers help with technical writing projects? I know it's probably already been talked about a little bit, but anyone have any sort of further explanation of that? Perhaps not. I suppose we can move on.
Well, so we had one customer that used the crowd for citations. So they had written a lot, and they needed specific citations, and so they could go find the original sources.
Well, that sounds good. Let's go ahead and wrap up today. These stats and more are included in the Daily Crowd Census, a quarterly industry report full of in-depth analysis on the microtasking field. If you'd like some accurate stats on the past 6 years of microtasking, send me an email, crowdcensus@dailycrowdsource.com, or sign up on our interest list at dailycrowdsource.com/crowdcensus. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. And we'll finish up with Casey.
Hi, I'm Casey Armstrong, Content Director for the Daily Crowdsource. Sorry to say we're out of time for today. I apologize if we weren't able to get to any of your questions. Luckily, this is a 5-part webinar series, and we have 3 great guest speakers for each to get the answers you want to know, so please join us. Next webinar, we will be hosting a talk with the CEOs of Lingotech and Microtask. These are companies specializing in translation and digitization. Rob Vandenberg and Vili Mietinen, along with CEO of Daily Crowdsource, David Bratvold. And we will send you an email with the details on how to register for that. Thanks again to our sponsors, Design Crowd, which offers custom graphic design work online to businesses, risk-free. You can learn more at designcrowd.com. And also we'd like to thank Napkin Labs, making your social networks more productive. You can learn more about Napkin Labs at napkinlabs.com. Thanks for joining us, and hope you have a good afternoon.